Two experienced mountaineers entered a remote Himalayan valley for what should have been a simple 2-day detour. But when a massive storm hit, they found themselves completely cut off from the outside world with no way to escape. For 622 days, they survived in one of Earth's most hostile environments using nothing but their wits, scientific knowledge, and sheer determination to stay alive through 2 brutal winters at 14,000 feet. But how do you survive nearly 2 years in a frozen valley where the temperature drops to -30? Food is almost non-existent, and rescue seems impossible. Olivia Chen, a 28-year-old marine biologist from Vancouver, had dreamed of the Himalayas since childhood when her grandmother would tell her stories of the sacred peaks and hidden valleys that existed beyond the reach of modern civilization. Her academic career studying extremophile organisms in harsh environments had taken her to Antarctica, the Arctic, and the deepest ocean trenches, but the roof of the world remained unconquered. Territory that called to her with an almost magnetic pull. She had spent 3 years preparing for this expedition, learning advanced mountaineering techniques, studying Tibetan language basics, and conditioning her body for the brutal demands of high-altitude survival. Ethan Torres, a 31-year-old wilderness photographer from Denver, had built his reputation capturing the world's most remote and dangerous landscapes. His coffee table books featuring Patagonian icefields, Alaskan wilderness, and African deserts had earned him international recognition. But the Himalayas represented the ultimate photographic challenge, a chance to document ecosystems and vistas that few humans had ever witnessed. His equipment bags contained over $40,000 worth of specialized cameras, lenses, and protective gear designed to function in temperatures that would kill most electronics within minutes. Their partnership had begun 2 years earlier when Olivia needed a photographer to document her research on high-altitude microbial life, and Ethan needed a scientist who could guide him to locations where nature revealed its most extreme secrets. They had worked together on expeditions to Mount McKinley, the Canadian Rockies, and the volcanoes of Kamchatka, each trip building trust and refining their ability to work as a team in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. Their friends called them crazy, but they understood each other in ways that only people who have faced death together can comprehend. The planning phase for their Himalayan expedition consumed 18 months of meticulous preparation. They studied satellite imagery, topographic maps, weather patterns, and historical accounts of every expedition that had entered the Dolpo region. Olivia contacted researchers at universities in Nepal, India, and Tibet, gathering data on everything from seasonal temperature variations to the altitude limits of plant and animal life. Ethan corresponded with photographers who had worked in similar environments, learning about equipment failures, common hazards, and the specific challenges of documenting life at extreme elevations. Their permit applications alone required 6 months of bureaucratic navigation. The Dolpo region was restricted territory where foreign visitors needed special authorization from the Nepal government, Chinese authorities, and local tribal councils. The paperwork filled 3 binders and cost them over $8,000 in fees, bribes, and administrative expenses, but the permits would give them access to valleys that had been closed to outsiders for decades, areas where ancient trade routes crossed passes that had been used for centuries by salt traders and yak herders. On September 15, 2019, they departed from Kathmandu in a chartered helicopter that would take them as far as the village of Dunai, the last outpost of modern civilization before the true wilderness began. The flight revealed the scale of what they were attempting as they rose above terraced hillsides into a landscape of impossible vertical relief where peaks disappeared into clouds and valleys dropped away into shadows so deep they seemed to have no bottom. The pilot, a weathered Nepali veteran of dozens of such flights, pointed out landmarks and warned them about weather patterns that could change from clear skies to life-threatening storms in less than an hour. Dunai was a collection of stone buildings clustered around a dirt airstrip where yaks shared space with the occasional helicopter landing. Their final preparations took 3 days as they hired local porters, checked equipment one last time, and acclimatized to the 8,000-foot elevation that would be their starting point. The village elder blessed their expedition with prayers and butter tea, but his eyes carried the weight of knowledge about mountains that had claimed many lives over the centuries. Their route would take them north through the valley of the Piri River, then east into increasingly remote terrain, following ancient paths that had been carved by generations of traders carrying salt from the Tibetan plateau to the markets of Nepal. The first week proceeded exactly as planned, with daily distances of 8 to 12 miles over terrain that gradually climbed from forest into alpine meadows, then into the stark beauty of high-altitude desert. Olivia collected water and soil samples at every elevation, documenting how microbial communities changed as oxygen levels decreased and temperatures became more extreme. Her research focused on organisms that could survive in conditions similar to Mars, making this expedition as much about astrobiology as earthbound science. Ethan captured images of landscapes that seemed almost alien in their harsh beauty, twisted rock formations, sculpted by wind and ice into shapes that defied imagination. Prayer Flags left by previous travelers creating the only splashes of color against endless browns and grays. By September 22nd, they had reached 13,500 feet and were camping in a valley where the silence was so complete they could hear their own heartbeats. Their bodies had adapted well to the altitude, with only minor headaches and fatigue that disappeared as their red blood cell counts increased. The weather had been favorable, with clear skies during the day and temperatures that dropped below freezing only at night. Their supplies were holding up perfectly, with enough food, water, purification tablets, and fuel to last another 3 weeks. That evening, as they studied their maps by headlamp light, Olivia noticed a narrow valley branching off from their planned route, marked on the topographic charts as unexplored terrain. It would add perhaps 2 days to their journey, but promised access to ecosystems that no scientist had ever studied. For Ethan, it represented photographs that no human eye had ever captured, images that could define his career and revolutionize how the world saw these remote places. They made the decision that would change everything, agreeing to investigate the unmarked valley before continuing toward their original destination. The morning of September 23rd dawned clear and cold, with visibility that seemed to stretch forever across peaks that rose like frozen waves toward the horizon. They left their main packs at a cache site marked with GPS coordinates and proceeded with day packs containing emergency supplies, water, and equipment for a reconnaissance mission into the mysterious valley. The entrance was deceptively welcoming, a gentle slope leading between granite walls that had been carved by glacial action over millions of years. As they descended into the unmarked valley, the landscape around them began to change in ways that made both of them pause with wonder. The walls rose higher and steeper, creating a natural cathedral of stone that filtered sunlight into ethereal beams that danced across surfaces polished smooth by countless centuries of wind and weather. Olivia immediately began collecting samples from pools of water that had never been touched by human hands, while Ethan photographed formations that looked like abstract sculptures created by some cosmic artist with infinite patience and time. The valley floor was a maze of boulders, some the size of small buildings, that had tumbled from the walls above, creating a labyrinth with no clear path forward. Their progress slowed to a crawl as they navigated between these massive obstacles, searching for passages that would allow them to continue deeper into this hidden world. Their GPS devices showed their position, but the satellite imagery was years old and revealed none of the complexity they were encountering on the ground. By midday, they had penetrated perhaps 2 miles into the valley, but the terrain was becoming increasingly challenging. What had appeared from the entrance to be a straight passage revealed itself as a series of interconnected chambers, each presenting new obstacles and route-finding puzzles. Loose rock made every step potentially dangerous, while narrow passages between boulders forced them to remove their packs and squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for human bodies. Olivia was documenting everything with the methodical precision that had made her reputation in the scientific community. Water samples showed bacterial communities unlike anything in the literature, while mineral deposits suggested geological processes that might have been ongoing for millions of years without human interference. Ethan found himself almost overwhelmed by photographic opportunities. Every turn revealed new compositions where light and shadow created natural masterpieces that challenged the limits of his equipment. But by late afternoon, the mountain weather that defines life in the Himalayas began to assert itself. Storm clouds that had been barely visible on the horizon when they entered the valley were now building into towering thunderheads that promised serious weather. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in less than an hour, while wind began to howl through the narrow passages with a sound like voices of ancient spirits warning intruders to leave. They needed shelter immediately, but the valley offered little protection from the kind of storm that was clearly developing. The walls were too steep to climb, and the floor provided no natural windbreaks beyond the scattered boulders that had been their obstacles all day. Ethan spotted what appeared to be an overhang about a quarter-mile deeper into the valley, and they hurried toward it as the first snowflakes began to fall. The overhang turned out to be smaller than it had appeared from a distance, barely large enough for both of them and their packs, but it was the only protection available as the storm intensified into a full Himalayan blizzard, the kind of weather event that could dump several feet of snow in a matter of hours and transform accessible terrain into an impassable wilderness. They huddled together, sharing body heat as the temperature plummeted and wind drove snow horizontally into their inadequate shelter. For 3 days and nights the storm raged with an intensity that neither of them had experienced even on their previous expeditions to some of the world's harshest environments. The sound was constant and overwhelming, a combination of howling wind, crashing snow, and the occasional rumble of avalanches. Somewhere in the distance they took turns staying awake to prevent their sleeping bags from becoming completely buried in the drifting snow that penetrated every gap in their shelter. Their supplies of food and fuel were meant to last for the brief reconnaissance mission they had planned, not for an extended survival situation trapped by weather, but rationing became critical as the hours stretched into days with no sign of the storm abating. They melted snow for water, conserved their stove fuel, and tried to maintain body temperature while burning as few calories as possible. When the storm finally cleared on September 27th, they emerged to find their world completely transformed. The valley that had been challenging but navigable was now buried under more than 4 feet of fresh snow. The boulders that had marked their route were hidden beneath drifts that could conceal crevasses or unstable formations. The narrow entrance they had used to reach this point was blocked by snow deposits that had been sculpted by wind into shapes that defied passage. Their first priority was attempting to retrace their steps, but every potential exit route was either blocked by snow or presented avalanche dangers that made travel impossible. The walls of the valley were too steep and now too icy to climb without specialized equipment. They had basic mountaineering gear, but nothing designed for the kind of technical ice climbing that escape would require. Olivia's scientific training kicked in as she began to assess their situation with the same methodical approach she brought to her research. They had enough food for perhaps a week if carefully rationed. Fuel for maybe 5 days of cooking and melting snow. Water sources were abundant but required fuel to make them safe to drink. Their emergency communication devices had been damaged by moisture during the storm, leaving them with no way to signal for help. Ethan suggested they build a more substantial shelter using the natural rock formations, and their top they found a spot where 2 large boulders leaned against each other, creating a triangular space that could be enclosed. They filled gaps with smaller rocks and tightly packed snow, creating walls that would block wind while allowing some ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning from their stove. The psychological impact of their situation was perhaps more challenging than the physical demands. They had gone from being experienced mountaineers in control of their expedition to being trapped victims dependent on survival skills they had hoped never to need. Seriously, Olivia dealt with the stress by focusing on scientific observation, documenting their environment and analyzing their resources with the same precision she had used in her research. Ethan channeled his anxiety into documenting their situation with his cameras, even though he wasn't sure anyone would ever see the images. The act of composing shots and thinking about light and shadow provided a mental escape from the reality of their predicament while creating a record that might someday help others understand what they had experienced. By the end of their first week trapped in the valley, they had established routines that would define their existence for the next 20 months. Each morning they would venture out to gather fuel, dried yak dung, and twisted juniper branches that grew stunted among the rocks. They set snares for pikas using wire salvaged from their damaged equipment and searched for any edible vegetation that might supplement their dwindling food supplies. The first winter nearly destroyed them both physically and mentally as temperatures dropped to levels that made every breath a conscious effort and every movement outside their shelter a calculated risk. The cold was beyond anything either of them had experienced, even on their previous expeditions to polar regions where at least they had proper equipment and regular resupply options. Their improvised shelter became both their sanctuary and their prison, a space barely large enough for 2 people to lie side by side while wind howled through cracks they could never completely seal. Their daily caloric intake dropped to starvation levels as their stored food disappeared, and they became entirely dependent on what they could trap or forage in an environment where most life had either migrated to lower elevations or entered dormancy. Olivia's knowledge of extremophile organisms proved crucial as she identified lichens and alpine mosses that provided minimal nutrition, while Ethan's photography skills helped them analyze terrain and weather patterns to predict the safest times for foraging expeditions. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical suffering as days blended into weeks with no variation except the gradual shortening of daylight and the increasingly brutal cold. They took turns staying awake through the endless nights, tending a fire that was often their only source of heat. When fuel ran low, they would huddle together, sharing body heat and trying not to think about families who must believe they were dead, about careers that were disappearing, about futures that seemed increasingly unlikely. Ethan began showing signs of serious mental strain, talking to himself for hours and arranging rocks into complex patterns that only made sense in his deteriorating mind. He would spend entire days photographing the same formations from different angles, as if documenting every shadow and texture could somehow transport him back to civilization. Olivia worried about his sanity, but also relied on his technical knowledge to maintain their equipment and create signaling devices from reflective surfaces. By February their bodies had adapted somewhat to the extreme conditions, but they were both showing signs of severe malnutrition that manifested in hair loss, loose teeth, bleeding gums, and a constant weakness that made even simple tasks exhausting. Olivia's scientific training helped her recognize symptoms of scurvy and other deficiency diseases, while Ethan used his artistic eye to document their physical deterioration in photographs that revealed the brutal toll their ordeal was taking. Spring brought psychological relief as much as physical improvement. When the snow began to melt and revealed more of the valley, they discovered a cave system that provided better shelter and protection from the wind that had been their constant enemy throughout the winter. The caves also revealed evidence that others had sheltered there before them. Ancient fire rings and primitive tools suggested that their valley had been used as emergency refuge for centuries by travelers crossing the high passes. The discovery of other human presence gave them hope that escape routes might exist, but also revealed the darker reality that previous visitors had not always survived. They found scattered bones and fragments of clothing that spoke of tragedies that had played out in this same location over the decades or perhaps centuries. The valley was not just their prison, but apparently a natural trap that had claimed other lives before theirs. Summer was their best season, relatively speaking, as temperatures rose above freezing during the day and allowed them to dry their clothing, repair their equipment, and venture further from their shelter. They found a greater variety of plants, including early shoots that provided vitamins their bodies desperately needed, and successfully trapped small birds that nested in the cliff faces during the brief breeding season. Olivia discovered a small patch of wild barley growing in a protected area, and they carefully cultivated it, hoping to harvest seeds that could be stored for the coming winter. Her scientific knowledge proved invaluable as she identified edible plants, avoided poisonous species, and developed techniques for processing foods to extract maximum nutrition from minimal resources. Ethan's photography became their primary hope for rescue as he used mirrors and shiny surfaces to reflect sunlight, hoping to catch the attention of aircraft, but they never saw any sign of search efforts. The isolation was so complete that they began to wonder if the outside world had forgotten them entirely, or if their families had given up hope after the initial search and rescue operations failed. By the second winter, they had learned enough about their environment to improve their chances of survival, but the psychological burden had become almost unbearable. They had long conversations about their families, wondering if parents and siblings had held memorial services, whether their professional colleagues had moved on to other projects, how the world was changing while they remained frozen in time. Olivia kept a detailed journal using charcoal made from their fires and writing in the margins of her research notebooks, documenting not just their survival techniques but their emotional journey through despair, hope, frustration, and the gradual acceptance that they might die in this valley. The act of writing became a form of meditation that helped her maintain mental stability when everything else seemed hopeless. Ethan continued photographing even as his equipment failed piece by piece, his camera bodies cracking from repeated freeze-thaw cycles and his lenses becoming permanently fogged with moisture that he could not remove. His images became increasingly abstract and artistic, as if his artistic vision was being refined by suffering into something more essential and truthful. During their second spring trapped in the valley, they made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring deeper into the cave system, Olivia found ancient drawings on the walls depicting humans and animals in styles that suggested great age. The artwork showed not just shelter scenes but what appeared to be route markers indicating passages through the surrounding mountains that they had never considered. Ethan studied the primitive maps with the same intensity he brought to analyzing photographic compositions, trying to correlate the ancient drawings with their modern topographic charts. The cave paintings suggested a route that led not back the way they had entered, but over a high col to the north. It would require climbing to elevations above 16,000 feet through terrain that would test their weakened bodies beyond anything they had yet endured. The ancient route markers gave them something they had lost: hope that there might be a way out of their prison that did not depend on rescue from the outside world. They spent weeks preparing for an escape attempt, gathering what remained of their climbing equipment, creating improvised tools, and building up their physical strength as much as their limited nutrition would allow. The decision to attempt escape came after almost 2 years of captivity, when they realized that another winter in the valley would likely kill them. Both their bodies had adapted to survival, but were operating at the absolute limits of human endurance. Their equipment was failing there. Food sources were becoming less reliable, and their mental state was deteriorating in ways that made long-term survival increasingly doubtful. The ancient cave drawings represented their only hope for freedom. Preparation for the escape attempt required weeks of careful planning as they studied weather patterns, identified potential campsites along the route, and gathered every piece of equipment that might be useful for high-altitude climbing. Their improvised gear included ropes made from braided clothing strips, anchors fashioned from salvaged metal, and tools created from rocks and bones they had found in the valley. Olivia used her scientific training to analyze the route shown in the cave paintings, calculating distances, elevations, and probable climbing times, while Ethan applied his knowledge of mountain photography to study how light and shadow revealed details about terrain that might not be obvious from topographic maps alone. They knew they would have only one chance, and that failure would mean death, either from exposure during the climb or starvation if they were forced to return to the valley. On August 12, 2021, after 697 days in captivity, they began their escape attempt, carrying packs loaded with their remaining food, water purification tablets, and every piece of climbing equipment they had managed to preserve or create. Their bodies were weak from nearly 2 years of malnutrition, but their determination was absolute. This was their last chance before winter returned to trap them permanently. The initial climb took them up the back wall of the valley through terrain that required technical rock climbing skills they had not used since before their ordeal began. Their improvised equipment held together through careful use and constant prayer as they ascended past 15,000 feet into air so thin that every movement required conscious effort. Their progress was measured in feet per hour rather than miles as they carefully tested each handhold and anchor point. Ethan used his photography skills to analyze the rock face, identifying the safest routes up surfaces that would challenge experienced climbers with proper equipment. Their makeshift ropes and tools were constantly on the verge of failure, but somehow held together as they climbed higher into an environment where a single mistake would mean death on the rocks below. After 18 hours of continuous climbing, they reached a ledge where they could rest and assess their progress. They were above 16,000 feet higher than either of them had ever climbed before and still had several hundred feet to go before reaching the col shown in the ancient drawings. The cold was intense even though it was summer, and they took turns sharing their single remaining sleeping bag to prevent hypothermia. The final push to the col required another 12 hours of technical climbing that pushed their weakened bodies beyond what should have been possible. They reached the pass just as the sun was setting on August 13th, and for the first time in almost 2 years they could see beyond their prison valley. Spread out below them was a different drainage system, and in the distance the unmistakable signs of human habitation, including the thin line of smoke that could only come from cooking fires. The descent proved almost as challenging as the climb as they navigated down unstable slopes and across swift mountain streams that had to be forded in darkness. They were both near complete collapse when they finally reached the tree line and encountered their first sign of civilization, a stone shelter used by yak herders that contained dried food and basic supplies. They spent their final night of captivity in the herders' shelter, sharing food that tasted like the most elaborate feast. After nearly 2 years of survival rations and foraged plants, the knowledge that they had escaped their valley prison gave them strength for the final push toward human contact, even though they were still miles from the nearest village. On August 15th, 2021, they stumbled into Rigsum, a village of fewer than 50 people who were amazed to see 2 foreign mountaineers who appeared to be starving and spoke in broken Nepali about being lost. For nearly 2 years the villagers provided food, shelter, and most importantly access to communication equipment that allowed them to contact the outside world for the first time since September 2019. News of their survival spread around the globe within hours as international media picked up the story of 2 mountaineers who had survived 697 days in one of the world's most remote locations. Their families, who had never given up hope despite official search efforts being suspended after 8 months, immediately flew to Nepal for emotional reunions that were broadcast live on television networks worldwide. The rescue helicopter that lifted them from Rigsum carried 2 people who had been fundamentally changed by their ordeal. They were thinner, weathered, and marked by experiences that few humans ever endure, but they were alive, and their survival represented a triumph of human determination over impossible odds. Their story became inspiration for mountaineers and adventurers while serving as a sobering reminder of how quickly expedition dreams can become survival nightmares. Olivia returned to her research with new focus on extreme environment survival and the psychological aspects of long-term isolation, while Ethan used his photographs from their ordeal to create exhibitions that raised awareness about wilderness safety and the importance of proper emergency planning. Their valley was officially named Chen Torres Valley in recognition of their survival, and a memorial was placed there to commemorate their ordeal. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories of human survival and the triumph of determination over seemingly impossible challenges.